Thanks. So, like any workshop that's split into two, how many people didn't go to the first one? Probably almost all of you. It was a really, really good workshop. The science, the thermal modelling, the sort of headline performance metrics, did the building work, did it not, what have you learned, what were the design features? It was a really good. Now we've recorded it and it will be on the website, so if you're interested in this stuff, please go and watch that first part. I'm going to pass around while we're talking. There's a little draft drawing here, and it's that's that lower part there. There's some diagrams there which start to hopefully encapsulate this strategic approach to this middle ground in terms of, do you go straight to a passive house in a cooling climate, in the very, very rare occasions where that is possible, or do you try to optimize the adaptive comfort approach to buildings, which can then be taken to a 3-zone model, which Huda is championing, which is very convincing, a multi-mode model, and then ultimately, potentially, you could then further improve it. So it's a continuum of improvement because you've done the basics right, and that's the kind of essence of what we're hoping we're heading towards here. Okay, so given that you've missed a lot of stuff, background stuff, I'm sure Huda's happy to go over it again. Who's got some questions? Jeff, you were just first, and then yourself. Go on. Yeah, you come to me.
Thanks very much, Huda. That was amazing. Really,
Thank you.
like an amazing presentation. And what you're doing is powerful and very important work. And challenging for a lot of people, I think.
Yeah.
But we need to not be dogmatic about these things and try and actually look at the evidence in a fuller way. So thank you for starts. I guess the first question that occurred to me is, like, I'm really interested in the tension between what the Institute might be looking for and what might be tenable and appropriate in these kinds of situations. But when you talk about adaptive comfort, what about, where does it sit with regards to vulnerable people? If you've got young people or elderly people with disabilities who don't have the ability to regulate their temperatures as much, how is that accounted for in your thinking?
So, yep. Thank you. So, a lot of research into adaptive thermal comfort is done on people of vulnerable populations. So you would find research for older people, you'd find research for younger people, and if you're designing where you know there's going to be a lot of that population, like an elderly house or for younger kids, you would look into, well, what is comfortable for them, because it still works. A child in the UK is not the same as a child in a hot country. Their tolerance will also not be the exact same, but at the end of the day, you have to see what the latest research for your area, because the adaptive thermal comfort model is fairly recent compared to the PMV, which has a lot more research into it. And I really love the inspiration of India. India has done so much work with the adaptive thermal comfort model, and they've then created their own standards that's built on what is comfortable for an Indian person, whether they're older or younger, and different situations. So I'm hoping that more research leads to more bespoke standards that are not just all humans should be comfortable at this temperature, but in our region, we're comfortable at this temperature. Yeah.
Did that answer all of that aspect of your question? Okay, who was it? So I think you were next one.
Did you look into evaporative cooling?
I
realise water's possibly an issue.
Yes, so evaporative cooling in a hot, humid climate is a no-go, because the humidity is already really high and it makes the sweating very difficult. So if you try to use evaporative cooling, it's hard. Also because the difference in the wet bulb temperature and the dry bulb temperature is not a lot. But in Sudan, for example, evaporative cooling is very efficient. The only problem is it's the same problem. They just slap an evaporative cooler onto a building without any planning of what to do. So then they put it into a sealed room. The humidity soars up. It's comfortable the first hour or two, but then the humidity is so high and it's just so closed up that it's not comfortable anymore. And then they have to open all the doors. So what I'm trying to advocate is that we design for the air conditioner, whether it's an evaporative cooler or an active cooling.
The eco-village did have boreholes, which I think the villagers treat as, endless water. Don't have enough information as to how long they might last, but it's obviously a good water supply. They use it for agriculture and drinking, but the idea of using it as some sort of evaporative cooling we wouldn't do that anyway because of exactly the reasons Huda, but it feels like a wasteful thing to do. Whereas a trip to Pakistan, in Gilgit-Baltistan in the north, higher elevation, just up the edge of the mountains, an extremely dangerous place to live in terms of boulder-filled floods, which is what we were looking at. They have mountain streams, maybe slightly less humidity issues. There are some intriguing possibilities of cooling roofs. As a mechanism, I can see it working there. Whether it's an actual solution looking for a problem, I don't know, but it's something that we could see working technically there. With the Tanzania house, the data loggers showed that at night, under the metal roof, it cools down pretty much in line with the external temperatures. Not much cooling at night. And the previous workshop showed these graphs, but because of the radiation loss to the night sky of the roof, it actually cools down half a degree cooler than the night sky under the metal roof. So there's an interesting mechanism there. But yes, that's enough on that. So who was next? Jeff again? Yeah.
One other thing that occurred to me, the point about for people to be using air conditioning when they need it, but not. How do you, from a user perspective, this is a really tough nut to crack, I suspect, but how do you find a way to engage with people to encourage them to, because this is about user behaviour really ultimately. I mean, I don't know what mechanisms you can put in to slap them on the wrist when they're trying to use the air conditioning when the conditions aren't right. That's a fascinating piece of research of it in itself. But I don't know if it's something that you thought about.
Can I have mic?
Yeah, sorry.
It's fine. So in my research on Sudan, I looked at air conditioning as not a singular thing, but as part of a wider behavior. There's generally a wider movement. People went from a traditional lifestyle that was very outdoor-based into an indoor-based lifestyle. So I went deeper than that. Why did they move to an indoor-based lifestyle? I found a lot of socioeconomic problems drove that. First of all, there's a lot of security issues. The city urbanized a lot. It became very large. They weren't safe anymore. So they're out. Oh, I'm pressing. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
I'm doing that to get back to the picture.
Okay. So people felt that they're no longer safe to use their outdoor space. So tackling that is part of the problem, because any time you can spend in a comfortable outdoor space is time taking away from the air conditioner, especially in a very hot, dry climate where the building has retained a lot of heat and that heat takes time to release. So that's why I talk about addressing the core issues. One of them for that is security. Another concern that they had was that there was a lot of mosquitoes, and in the past the government used to spray the areas of mosquitoes, but they stopped doing that. Of course, you can't ask the government to go back because there's no government control, but what you can do is focus on installing those mosquito nets, which actually you'd think they'd use them, but no, they're not very common at all. People just use the bed nets, which are not comfortable. Very, very hot. Another part of the problem is because of urbanization, land prices were increasing and people didn't have the money to go buy a new plot of land. So what they do is they expand in their own land. So then they can't live their traditional life that depended on having this huge yard to move into different parts of, because that yard doesn't exist anymore. So addressing that, one of the key ways I address that is providing an adequate roof space for that outdoor time. It has to be shaded for privacy, because that was another concern. In the past, all the buildings were ground floor buildings, so being in the yard was private. But now all of these multi-rise buildings, you are no longer private in your own backyard. But if you create a space that is shaded, that is covered, but it also has to be lightweight so that it loses heat at night and you can spend there. But at the end of the day, it's occupant behavior. You can't 100% control it, but you can put the means for occupants to enjoy the building in an adaptive way, because if you don't put it, they're not going to use it at all. So for example, in one of the houses, I recommended, like I said, to install the mosquito nets. And once they installed it, they were more able to use the windows. They'd never used their windows. They were just a feature on the wall to them. But suddenly they started using them, and especially during nighttime when there was a power cut, because even if they want to use the air conditioners, there's still that limitation of power cuts almost half of the time. So they're going to use adaptive thermal comfort. This is where you're just facilitating that, you're providing the opportunity. And I think education will go a long way, showing them their impact. And I talked to a lot of people about what they thought about the environment, and I found they linked it mostly with like recycling and waste, but when it came to energy, there wasn't a lot of understanding. There was just one occupant that said to me, if I save energy, that means there's more energy for someone else to be able to keep, because she was aware that there's so many power cuts because everyone is consuming a lot of power. And if there were more people like her, she would be the type that would keep to the set point, that would do adaptive behavior and do her share. It's very similar to here, that you try to advocate people doing sustainable stuff by educating them, by increasing their awareness, and that becomes that motivation. But it's a personal choice at the end of the day. Yep.
I wonder to what extent air movement plays in your thinking, because it is a very significant element.
Yes.
Is the rest of your presentation before this?
It should be there. Yeah, you could go back to the first part. PMV stands for predicted mean vote. So there's two ways of assessing comfort. The predicted mean vote looks at it from a purely physical standpoint. You put in these parameters, wind, air temperature, and it pumps out a number of what is comfortable. But the adaptive thermal method puts into account that there's other factors that we can't consider, like behaviors, like psychological, physiological. And that's why a lot of adaptive thermal comfort studies tell you it's comfortable in this country, this is the comfort temperature, they try not to generalize that. So, because there's a lot of factors that they don't know why it's this specific. So yeah, in the PMV method, because of the physical parameters that it looks at, the comfort band is a lot more rigid. And here is the comfort in our project using the PMV method on a still day. And as you can see, there's a bit of a portion over there that is too hot. It's still 77 to 87% of the time in the comfort zone. But once you increase the wind speed to 1.2 meters per second, we can't go higher than that because, well, pens fly and things go around. But at this rate, the comfort shifts towards this direction. But then you create all of this area that is too cold. So that's why it becomes even more important that the occupants have control, that they, that they can choose to turn on that wind speed and decrease it. Like if it's a really windy day and they're cold, that they can close things off. Or if it's a very still day, they can turn on a fan and achieve that comfort. So giving the occupants control increases that comfort band.
Could we show them the diagram of the House 5 to show where this air movement actually happens?
Do you mean which one?
Yeah. I'd like to, after this, get back to this kind of issue with this issue with the Passivhaus Institute, and I'll explain the context of the Building Action Coalition and stuff. So those are the features of the actual as-built design. So we ended up, So the actual as-built design features are there. Windows, as big as possible, as low as possible, to allow air movement across the whole body, and that's both walking around but also in bunk beds, high and low bunk beds. 3 requirements for the windows: security, a degree of privacy, insect protection, and wind control. So perforated steel sheets instead of wrought iron bars we adopted for the security, painted white for additional reflectivity, although the roof shades almost all the windows. Then a layer of insect mesh, fixed insect mesh, and then we haven't installed this yet, but Venetian blinds, which allow quite a lot of options for both daylight control and also allowing some air movement without just turning it on and off. Curtains are not good. It's on or off with curtains, doesn't work. And then ceiling vents, and then a ventilated roof with the gables closed off and a split ridge. So you can see the sense of that. So in a very still day, which Huda was talking about, stack effect is what we rely on to create air movement. In a windy day, the low pressure area on the leeward side of the house roof will create a suction through the house, and that will generally generate a higher airflow. So that was the basic principles of the design after we'd experimented for a bit. There is a temperature difference. That roof gets very hot. Yeah. If the data shows that, yes, as you might imagine, very high temperatures under that metal roof, so there's plenty of stack effect. It doesn't mean you get a roaring gale, it just encourages air movement. So the context then of this discussion, the reason we have had a discussion with the Passivhaus Institute, and we're going to have to, is because we're part of United Nations Environment Programme new group called the Building Action Coalition, and it has a lot of members, and many of those members are international passive house organisations. Now, if you're being uncharitable, you could say they have a very fixed view that passive house should be the way to go in cooling climates like this. Huda's mentioned that some of the they've obviously made relaxations appropriate to the climate, but what perhaps they haven't done is just tackle this slight sense of unreality of socio-economic situations. When you're there, there's not going to be many passive houses built. Meanwhile, there are many, many substandard, and we're talking millions of homes being built reliant on aircon, and that is like a very dangerous infrastructure that is going to be left. So we're interested in working with the Building Action Coalition. They want to work with us because of the expertise that we're gathering together, people like Huda, to explore this intermediate ground. So our response to them saying, well, you have to think about old people and babies and this heat, Huda's 3-zone model, which makes a lot of sense to me, is the answer to that. So maybe it's worth talking about that.
So as part of my research, I looked into the socio-economic context, and I found that the problem with these contexts, you can't meet all the parameters. It's just impossible. There's just too many. And even a big part of it was that in the house, you have an older generation that's used to a communal lifestyle, that's used to hotter temperatures. And then you have the younger generation that each wants their own bedroom, they want their privacy, they want their air conditioner. So it's really hard for one house to meet all of those needs at the same time. So what I'm working on is a framework to design a mixed mode building where you look at the house as a group of zones, it's kind of like a chimera instead of a homogeneous smoothie kind of thing. So you create, for example, in the hot, dry climate of Sudan, I suggested you create a small air-conditioned zone, which in Sudan would be the bedrooms. You can make them a bit smaller, and I talk about how this has an impact on the social situation. In Sudan, people needed big rooms because everyone stayed in that one room. They'd build one room and everyone was in that room. So it had to be as big as possible. But if you're going to air condition it, the smaller the room is, the easier it is for you to cool because there's less air volume for you to cool. So you create that zone, and then you create a zone that is comfortable during the day with as little air conditioning as possible. And that would be a zone, for example, that has a lot of thermal mass, very high ceilings, stack ventilation. You'd ideally locate it in the best orientation in the building so that when there's a power cut, there's somewhere to stay. And also because a lot of the older residents I found, they were at home during the day. And they were the people who were less likely to use air conditioners. So then you've created a zone that's for them. And then the third zone that you need to create, is, which I talk about a little bit, is a night zone, somewhere where they can sleep when there's a power cut, or if they just want to, where you create an outdoor space. And I suggested, again, utilizing, in this new context of an urban world, utilizing the roof space, and that roof space will also cover and shade the concrete of the structure below it, the high thermal mass. Because in my research, I found that shading that concrete had a huge impact. Like in one of the thermal photos that I had, the concrete was all blaringly red from the thermal photo, except 2 dots that were blue. And I was just surprised, what are those 2 dots? And I went to the roof and I found it was just 2 beds that they left on the ceiling. So just a bed that was just a metal frame, and that had a huge impact even into the night, because the thermal mass is like a battery. As the day went on, it absorbed so much heat that at night it was absolutely so uncomfortable. So it's just creating zones that, in an ideal world, you'd create a fully passive house building where they could, have everything air conditioned and all, but you can't do that. But you can create zones so that when they need to be in their private rooms, they can use air conditioned there, but they also have the opportunity to use other spaces, and there's that diversity. And the idea is not new. It stems from a lot of vernacular concepts. In the past, they had summer rooms and winter rooms. They had the concept of having a refuge somewhere for when it's... So it's just utilizing that concept and reintroducing it back into modern houses.
So it'd be worth just looking at what it would take to make that a passive house. So there's 2 approaches to that. One is retrofitting it to be a passive house. The other is designing it as a different shape from the beginning as a passive house. So a picture of the... Oh, no, that's the only picture I've got. If we go back to that. That's the test unit. Okay. So if we were to say, perhaps we retrofitted that, what would it take to get that to comply to Passivhaus in a cooling climate for a certification? So very rough, quick PHPP before we came out. Tim did that for us. I don't think he's here. 150 mil of insulation under the concrete slab. Something like 150 mil of external wall insulation over that. 250 mil of insulation over the rafters. Air tightness, which is relatively easy. In fact, the air tightness is probably the least challenge in this situation because it's all wet plaster, solid masonry floors and plasterboard. So actually that could possibly be, relatively easy. The ceiling vents would obviously be closed. You'd be turning this into a permanent whole house, air-conditioned, efficient home. But it would still take quite a lot of electricity, but it would be cheap because at the moment electricity costs are low in these countries. And fairly dirty grid, I think, although Tanzania does have quite a lot of hydroelectric power, and that is increasing with Chinese investment. So again, it's about the building is part of a system, so we need to bear that in mind. Now, the other thing I haven't talked about is, of course, thermal bridging. So the design does have these blockwork fins. Those could have been designed out. Those are obviously thermal bridges in the other way to a cooling climate. So air temperature mainly, because they're so shaded, air temperature will heat that up, and the block of the patio outside, and any walls, these walls exposed down to the sand, it's quite a step up at one end of the building. Those will be absorbing heat, and heat bridges will take that, thermal bridges will take that in and warm the building. So there is a problem with thermal bridging. Now those could be designed out. That's potentially relatively easy. You've also got the ability for the external wall insulation to go out and down, right down to the sand there. So you could mitigate that to some. That's not necessarily a major problem with this current design. Interestingly, the floor there is made up of local rock, a coral rock. It's a very lightweight, full of bubbles rock, which I should imagine is probably not far off something like glasspool, a foamed insulating thing. So that's actually quite an interesting. So what I did is I changed Tim's polystyrene insulation to what I thought coral rock might give to test that. So as I said, something like 150 mil of insulation, 100 to 150 depending on the performance. 250 over there, air tightness and a dehumidifier and ventilation system. Now that's quite an expensive. Windows, thank you. Okay, so the retrofit idea would be leave the metal guarding in place, perhaps even leave the inset mesh in place, put inward opening, single glazed timber casements made airtight. So there's an issue. That would probably complete what could be a certifiable passive house. Now, if you were to design it from the beginning, it's possible that those measures down below, you'd have designed out the thermal bridges, which would reduce your need for insulation. It's possible that your solution for insulating the flat roof could become the roof. You could still have a ventilated roof, but you might not need all of this stuff, possibly. So there's some interesting areas to explore. I'm not strong on services. You may be a little bit stronger, but you read the documentation, and yes, you'd need some, dehumidification and some, maybe heat pump to cool the air supply. But some of the detail of that I get a bit lost in. But
sorry, the building you've described, the passive house you're describing, would be more expensive and would use more carbon.
Yep.
So it just strikes me as highly unlikely that a particular building model developed in Northern Europe in a particular set of social, economic and political, cultural circumstances is worth trying to transform somebody else. And obviously the challenge here is you'd love the AECB to a version of the Tanzanian AECB.
Exactly, the level 1, level 2.
And catch up and like do 30 years to develop. I don't know, next question. What are you going to do? How are you going to do it?
AECB standard for the global sector?
Well, kind of thinking, obviously, aren't we, that may be where it goes. But you're absolutely right. We are not currently proposing that we're just thinking, what would it actually look like if we were to do it for Passivhaus? What we're more thinking about is, can we create design guides that create affordable, single-layered constructions that are affordable and doable, that can be improved consequentially, following this sort of logical sequence. Looks like we could do. I mean, it's just a very interesting area. We think there's work to be done here because of the huge potential. Now, of course, getting people to stop what they're already doing, just building houses exactly as they're doing it in Africa, who are the champions for this? That's maybe this is just as impossible to do subtle changes as trying to get everyone to build Passivhaus. It seems more possible, but it doesn't mean it is possible. Come closer, Jeff. Come closer.
That's the question that would interest me. I mean, how do you make this aspirational? How do you engage with people and make them excited by this as a concept? And because they may have very well established ideas in their head of what they want in terms of how they want their life to develop.
Yes.
And what kind of dream they have, consumerist dream for how they, for what products they want and so on. So how does that whole piece of work, thinking about how to I hate to use the word, but to sell this concept,
Yes.
it seems to me like essential.
Yes.
Can I say something and then you?
Yep.
So we have had some sporadic feedback about the house. Correct me if I'm wrong, Kamran, but I think this is... So, for example, a lorry driver who was delivering stuff came and went into the building and was rather wowed by it. So what did it represent? It was light and airy, it looked modern, so it had an aspirational quality. It's quite generous, so obviously it's a bit of a, this is like a big house, giant house. They kind of there was a bit of a conversation about the windows and the air movement and the comfort, and I think it clicked. A bit like visiting a Passivhaus here, you get it when you visit it. So it did feel like this could represent an aspirational way of building. There will be tweaks. If you're designing a house that local people could emulate that, they could copy that. There's some practicalities, you don't want people making changes that completely change how it works. If they can't afford Venetian blinds and they put curtains in, you're going to screw the design, aren't you?
So a lot of what you're talking about was part of my research, is why do people do the things they did? And it's one of the questions I did ask people. Why did you choose this? Why did you do that? And a lot of them had very comfortable houses that they changed just for social aspirations, that everyone else is doing this, so I did this. They had a perfectly comfortable wooden roof that they replaced with a metal, and that was so hot that they'd have to find an alternative. So, and a lot of them, another problem, I interviewed a lot of architects, and they tell me there's a lot of architects that want to build sustainable buildings, but the problem is when they try to convince their clients come with very, very specific ideas, because this is a country where there is no security, there is no insurance, there is no certification, it's a passive house, it's going to work well. So what people depend on is word of mouth. I want the house that my cousin has. I want the house that my uncle has, something that they've seen that they know works. So the only way, honestly, to get people to adopt this is to build exemplar buildings and then have people see them and then see that it's not that hard. We didn't have to make that much changes. Your life doesn't have to be very negatively impacted. It still meets their core needs of a modern building, like that lorry driver said, that it still looks modern, even if it relies on vernacular concepts. What they don't want is the look. That's the key aspect of it. And in the past, I looked at what the government in the past did, and they built a house in Sudan in the 1960s that they just introduced this radical new idea where people in Sudan lived a very social life in their rural areas, but when they tried to bring that to the cities, they just couldn't, and they wanted privacy, but the land plot was small, so they came up with this radical idea of, instead of building all your rooms facing the same direction, why don't you build 2 rooms facing opposite directions? It was a very simple idea. They built it in all their government houses, but then other people started seeing it, seeing how effective, because they had 2 separate courtyards, and then people, males and females, could be segregated, and it didn't cost them much. It was very simple to do. So they started integrating that into middle-class houses, into wealthier houses where they incorporated that. So I really think, I know it's really hard to get the government in these countries to cooperate, but if it was possible that the government could build several houses like this and start to advocate for it, then people will see, okay, it's not that hard, I can do that, I just need to make a few changes. And that's why we're trying to keep it as accessible as possible, not trying to introduce a technology that's really hard to get or really expensive, because every little bit matters, and if more people can make even these small changes. Because right now, these houses are consuming 2,000 kilowatts a month, which is what you'd expect a UK house, if it's efficient, to consume in a whole year. So that consumption is so high, and the grid is just failing, And the power cuts are not consistent. They're getting worse and worse because the problem is increasing. More people are using air conditioners, and right now they're even starting to buy batteries to save energy when there's more energy, so it's creating a higher demand, and it's going to create more and more inequality where richer people have access to generators, have access to batteries, and poorer people, every time that power cuts, they're going to lose their food, they're going to lose everything. So it's really, really important that we try to address this problem, and particularly these middle and upper classes, trying to encourage them to reduce their consumption a bit so there's a bit more for everyone.
So 3 o'clock. Come on, you don't just want to make final comment on whether you think this could... Okay. I think, is it true, will the Tanzanian president open this, do you think? Is that still on the cards? Okay, so there you go. Tanzanian president, that could have a bit of a ripple effect. Leave it there. Thanks very much. Thank you, Huda.
Thank you.